Hey there, viewers. Quick question. Have you ever had food so bad it made you sick? Drop your worst food experience in the comments. Today's story takes a disturbing turn inside Diddy's prison cell, where he ate something he never should have, and what happened next was absolutely terrifying. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The smell of rot. I first caught wind of that awful smell on my second night at MDC Brooklyn. It drifted through the corridors like a slow-moving fog, heavy and inescapable. At first, I thought it was the usual mix of sweat, bleach, and the stale odor of old walls that every prison seems to have. But this was different. It had a sweetness to it, like decaying fruit, and underneath that, something sharp and chemical. The combination made my stomach turn. I tried to ignore it, but the more I breathed, the more I sensed it getting into my clothes, my hair, my very skin. I had heard rumors that someone famous was locked up in here, but I didn't really believe it. There was always talk, some star athlete or big-shot gangster rumored to be in solitary, or maybe a former politician doing time. But this was MDC Brooklyn, a place that felt more like a crumbling warehouse than a high-profile detention center. The bricks were chipped, the paint peeled off in strips, and the lighting flickered. The gloom felt endless. To me, the idea that someone with real celebrity was stuck in this rotting place sounded too absurd to be true. On that second night, though, I saw him for the first time. He walked past my cell, escorted by two guards who looked more amused than cautious. He had the same face I'd seen in magazines and on TV, Diddy, only he was a shadow of the man I remembered. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes ringed and gray, and his once confident stride was slow. It was like he was weighed down by a lifetime of regrets in the span of a few weeks. I watched him from the narrow window in my cell door. He didn't glance in my direction or acknowledge the other inmates pressing their faces to the glass to catch a glimpse. He just kept walking, shoulders hunched, gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I'd heard rumors about him refusing to eat the prison meals. People claimed he was bribing guards to bring him protein bars and leftover scraps from the staff lounge. Most inmates didn't care. To them, it was just another story about a rich guy trying to escape the grim reality of prison life. But I couldn't help being curious. Was he really living off smuggled rations? And if so, why had he stopped eating from the cafeteria altogether? That same night, the smell in the air got worse. Even lying on my bunk with my face turned to the wall, I couldn't escape it. I pressed my shirt to my nose, breathing through the thin fabric, but it barely helped. My cellmate was still being processed in another block, so I was alone in that cramped space. I told myself it was just the stress of the new environment, that I was imagining things. After all, the cafeteria food was never good, but there was no reason to assume it was literally rotten. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Morning came, and I shuffled along with the other inmates to the chow hall. The place was as unwelcoming as ever, with its flickering fluorescent lights and chipped tables that rocked if you put too much weight on one side. The line moved slowly, a line of blank faces and hollow eyes. I picked up my tray and let the server slop a spoonful of watery eggs onto my plate. They were pale yellow, flecked with gray bits I didn't want to identify. On another section of the tray, there was a piece of bread that looked like it'd been left out for days. Still, hunger gnawed at me, and I tried not to think too hard about it. That's when I spotted Diddy again. He stood at the far end of the room, leaning against the wall near a guard. He wasn't holding a tray. His arms were crossed like he was in a standoff. The guard shook his head, spoke something in a low voice, and then jerked his thumb toward the serving line. Diddy's shoulders slumped as he realized he had no choice. The days of bribing for better food must have ended. Slowly, he stepped into line, picking up a tray with trembling hands. I found a seat near the corner, trying to blend in. The smell of the food around me was enough to make me lose my appetite, but I forced myself to take a few bites. As I chewed, I noticed the edges of my bread had a greenish tint, mold. I set the bread down, wiped my mouth, and drank some water. The rest of my tray looked barely edible, but I was hungry enough to keep trying. That's survival here. Ignore the details and keep yourself alive. My gaze wandered back to Diddy. He finally got his tray and carried it to a table near the middle of the room. He didn't sit with anybody. He just set the tray down, stared at the food, and took a deep breath. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his posture, as though he knew something terrible was coming. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering in and out, casting shadows that danced across his face. When he lifted a piece of meat to his lips, I saw him pause. Maybe he smelled something rancid, or maybe it was just the reality of his situation hitting him. Then he put the meat in his mouth, chewed, and swallowed. He grimaced after the first bite. He looked around the way someone does when they're in a dangerous place, wanting to make sure nobody is watching them show weakness. But of course, we were all watching. Curiosity is the only entertainment we get here. He took another bite, forced it down, and then pushed the tray aside. That was all he could manage. He stood up and left his tray untouched, except for those couple of bites. I finished what I could of my own meal, an effort mostly to keep my strength up, then followed the crowd back to the cell block. On my way out, I passed by Diddy's table, and I caught a whiff of the meat he'd left behind. It smelled spoiled, that same sickly scent I'd noticed drifting through the corridors. The servers had tried to mask it with heavy seasoning, but it wasn't enough to hide the rot. The rest of that day felt like a slow, suffocating march. The smell lurked everywhere, intensifying in closed-off spaces like the laundry room or the common area where inmates waited for yard time. Some said it was coming from the vents, that maybe a rat died up there. Others whispered that the staff was cutting corners with the food supply, letting stuff go rancid before serving it to us. I couldn't decide which theory scared me more. That evening, as I lay on my bunk staring at the cracked ceiling, my cellmate still hadn't arrived. I had too much time to think. Images of Diddy's drawn face kept coming back to me, the way his eyes seemed hollow. I couldn't forget how he looked at that tray of meat, like it might jump up and attack him. I wondered if he was in his cell right then, trying not to vomit, or if he was pacing around, too hungry to sleep. Either way, I figured it wouldn't be long before the stress of this place tore him apart. I tried to block it all out, the smell, the worry, the sense that something was creeping under the surface of everyday prison life. I told myself to just keep my head down. People who stood out or showed too much curiosity didn't last long here. But that night, the stink got worse, invading my dreams. I dreamt of rotting meat crawling with maggots, and of an unseen figure laughing in the distance while the guards watched with empty eyes. When I woke the next day, I half expected the smell to be gone, as if it had all been a nightmare. But it was still there, lingering like a toxic fog. My stomach churned when I breathed in too deeply. The morning routine was the same as before. Line up for chow, pick up the tray, try not to think too hard about what was on it. This time my meal had some kind of sausage patty that looked grayish-brown. I took one bite and immediately regretted it. The aftertaste clung to my tongue, metallic and sour. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Diddy come in. He walked slower than usual, one hand pressed to his stomach. The guard next to him didn't give him much space, almost like he was expecting Diddy to keel over any moment. Diddy seemed to sense that something was deeply wrong with him, but maybe he had no choice now. He had to eat or starve. I watched him accept a new tray, some pale eggs and more questionable meat. He stared at it for a long time. His hands shook when he gripped his fork, and I saw him say something under his breath. Then he took a bite. His lips pressed together, and he swallowed hard. I don't think he tasted anything good. I think he just forced it down. I tried to finish my meal, but my own nausea rose. I pushed the tray away, opting to drink some water instead. That was when I overheard one of the guards muttering to another. He's been getting weaker. Maybe he'll finally learn he ain't special. I felt a chill run through me, And it wasn't just the temperature in the room. They were talking about Diddy like he was a spectacle, some sideshow. The guard who spoke looked pleased, like seeing him suffer was an event. I wondered how much was neglect and how much was intentional. Either way, it sent a clear message. No one was safe from the decay in this place. After chow, as we all filed out, Diddy stayed behind, still nibbling at the food. The guard towered over him, arms crossed. I told myself to move on. There was nothing I could do. But a knot of dread formed in my gut. I had a feeling we were all about to witness something terrible, whether we wanted to or not. I returned to my cell, trying to wipe my mind of the image of him sitting there, forcing down something that might be killing him from the inside. But the smell followed me, latching on like a ghost. There was no escaping it, just like there was no escaping the truth that something in this prison was deeply, dangerously wrong. I didn't know how long it would be before it claimed me, too. I tried to distract myself with the usual routine, push-ups, pacing the cell, reading the same battered novel I'd borrowed from someone in the next block, but nothing blocked out that smell or the memory of Diddy's sunken eyes. Eventually, I crawled onto the bunk, the thin mattress creaking beneath me, and closed my eyes. My last thought before drifting off was that maybe the nightmares would be a relief compared to the reality waiting for me when I woke up. Chapter 2. A taste of rot. I woke up to shouting in the hallway. My first thought was that a fight had broken out, maybe a scuffle over a stolen meal or some prison debt. But then I heard the words clearly through the door. "He's sick! He's real sick!" Somebody was banging on the bars, yelling for help. My heart thudded in my chest as I swung my legs over the bunk and hurried to the small window. A group of inmates was gathered near a cell a few doors down. I couldn't see who was inside, but the commotion was enough to draw the attention of the guards. Two of them rushed over, nightsticks ready. "Break it up," one barked. "Back off or I'll send you all to the hole." The inmates scattered, but one of them kept pointing into the cell, insisting that whoever was in there needed medical attention. The guard sneered, told him to shut up, and stepped inside. My view was blocked by the door, but I heard somebody retching, a nasty sound like a clogged drain. Then I heard a moan. A chill went through me as I realized that moan wasn't just someone feeling queasy. It was the sound of a person in serious pain. Eventually, the guards dragged the inmate out of the cell, limp and hunched over. I craned my neck to see, and that's when I realized it wasn't Diddy. It was another guy I vaguely recognized from chow time. He looked green in the face, sweat pouring down his brow, eyes rolling back in his head. The guards hauled him away, leaving a smear of vomit on the floor. One guard shouted for a mop, while the other walked off, muttering curses under his breath. The hallway cleared, and I was left with a sense of foreboding. If the rumors about rotten food were true, this could be a sign that something much worse was brewing. It wasn't just about having to eat nasty scraps. It could be outright dangerous, lethal even. And if this was happening to an ordinary inmate, how long before Diddy found himself in the same predicament? When the time came for breakfast, I shuffled back to the cafeteria with everyone else. The line was silent today, a far cry from the usual muttering and half-hearted jokes. People kept looking around, as though they expected a guard to pounce on them any second. The tension was thick, that constant hum of fear that in prison can turn violent at any moment. I picked up my tray and saw what looked like sausages, but they were a shade too gray, glistening under the harsh lights. My stomach churned. The memory of that sick inmate had left me unsettled, but I tried to keep a neutral expression. Drawing attention to your disgust was a fast way to become a target. I slid onto a seat near the back corner of the room and took a cautious bite. It tasted old, like freezer burn masked by a heavy dose of salt and pepper. I forced it down, reminding myself I needed the calories. A moment later, Diddy walked in. He was alone, as usual, the guard trailing a few steps behind him like a silent threat. He held his tray with both hands, but I could see the tremble in his wrists. Even from across the cafeteria, I noticed the dark circles under his eyes had grown more pronounced. He was losing weight fast, his cheekbones jutting out in sharp angles. He took a seat at a table not far from me, barely acknowledging the handful of inmates who stared at him. I watched him lift a forkful of eggs to his mouth. He chewed slowly, each motion seemingly an effort. I couldn't read his expression, but I guessed that every bite was a battle. He swallowed, took another bite, and paused. I noticed a faint twitch in his jaw. Then he set the fork down and raised his eyes, scanning the room as though expecting danger. Our eyes locked briefly, and something in his gaze told me he was well aware that something was terribly wrong with the food. He lowered his head and tried another bite. This time I saw his entire body shudder. He pressed a hand to his stomach, swallowed hard, and pushed the tray away. For a moment I thought he might vomit right there, but he didn't. He just sat, shoulders quaking, breathing in and out, looking like he was on the verge of collapse. The guard behind him stifled a grin, as if he found the whole display amusing. When chow ended, we all got up to leave. Diddy stayed seated, his face a mask of exhaustion. The guard tapped his baton against the floor impatiently, but he didn't move. Eventually, Diddy rose on unsteady legs, and I watched him walk out with a stiff gait, like every step caused him pain. I felt a tug of sympathy I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was because, despite his fame, he was just another person trapped in this place, forced to swallow whatever was served. The rest of the day passed in a blur of monotony. I went to the yard for a bit, did some push-ups, tried to keep my head down, but that knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. The memory of that sick inmate haunted me, and so did the image of Diddy shivering in the cafeteria. That smell, that pungent odor of decay was everywhere, creeping into the corners of my mind. I couldn't escape the feeling that this was all building towards some awful climax. That night, I had trouble sleeping. My cellmate had finally arrived, a wiry older man who barely spoke, and he was snoring on the bunk beneath me. The vent overhead kept rattling. I swore I heard scratching inside it, like rodents scuttling around. I tried not to think about it, but every time I closed my eyes, I pictured dead rats lodged somewhere in the air ducts, their bodies decomposing and releasing that sweet sour smell into the prison's ventilation system. Sometime after midnight, I sat up on my bunk, sweating and thirsty. The corridor outside was quiet, though I heard the occasional shuffle of guards making their rounds. I slipped off the bunk and walked to the small sink, sipping a few gulps of lukewarm water. That's when I heard a cough echo from down the hall, followed by a choked gag. Then came retching. My heart pounded as I listened to the unmistakable sound of someone vomiting, their heaves echoing in the darkness. Another voice, quieter, tried to offer comfort, but it was cut short by a guard's command to be quiet. A flicker of panic passed through me. Was it Diddy this time? Or another inmate succumbing to whatever rot was in the food? I pressed my ear to the door, but all I heard were the guard's boots stomping by, then more muffled coughing. Eventually it went silent, and I was left with the low hum of the ventilation system carrying that dreadful odor. In the morning, I stood in line for chow again, my stomach tied in knots. I had half a mind to skip the meal entirely, but that would only make me weaker, and weakness in prison was like a neon sign inviting trouble. So I took my tray, stared at the watery grits and the unidentifiable meat patty, and tried not to think too much. My appetite was nearly gone, but I forced down a few bites. I noticed Diddy across the room again, sitting by himself, tray untouched. He looked even worse than before, pale and sweat-drenched, like he'd been up all night wrestling with his stomach. After a few minutes, he picked up a spoon and stirred whatever was on his plate. His face twisted in disgust, but he lifted the spoon to his mouth anyway. Hunger must have outweighed caution. He managed 2, maybe 3 bites before he doubled over, clutching his abdomen. The guard next to him just watched, offering no help. A few inmates at nearby tables threw him sidelong glances, not sure if they should intervene. Intervention in here was risky. Guards didn't like it when inmates stuck their noses in someone else's suffering. That moment felt like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Diddy tried to stand but stumbled, bracing himself against the table. A layer of sweat glistened on his forehead. It looked like he was fighting the urge to vomit right there on the floor. The guard finally stepped forward, more to avoid a mess than out of concern, I guessed. "Come on," I heard the guard say, practically dragging him up by the arm. Diddy let out a weak groan, his face contorted in pain. He tried to walk, but his legs buckled. Another guard rushed over, grabbed his other arm, and the two of them half carried, half dragged him out of the cafeteria. A hush fell over the room, every inmate watching with wide eyes. It felt like we were all seeing a glimpse of our own possible future. I pushed my tray away, appetite gone. My thoughts churned, desperate to find some reassurance, but there was none. The staff, from the guards to the kitchen workers, didn't seem to care. If something was seriously wrong with the food, they weren't fixing it. Maybe this was punishment for being who he was, or maybe they just didn't care if we all got sick. Either way, it was terrifying to realize that we were utterly at their mercy. The rest of chow passed in uneasy silence. I saw a few other inmates pick listlessly at their food, while some gobbled it down as if they couldn't afford to stop. Nobody spoke much. The tension weighed on me like a lead blanket. When we were herded back to our cells, I caught a glimpse of a guard rolling a large trash bin out from the kitchen area. A sour, putrid stench hit me full force, almost knocking me back. Whatever was in that bin smelled worse than anything I'd encountered yet. I made my way back to my cell, mind racing. Diddy's condition was spiraling downward, and I couldn't shake the suspicion that the rotten food was doing more than just giving him a stomachache. As I tried to settle on my bunk, my cellmate coughed from below, a deep, rattling sound. I wondered if he was about to fall victim to the same illness that seemed to be spreading through the block. Looking at the bare concrete ceiling, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining all of this. But every time I breathed, that rancid odor told me otherwise. Something truly rotten was festering in MDC Brooklyn, and the consequences of ignoring it were growing more terrifying by the day. Chapter 3. The fever. I didn't see Diddy for almost a full day after they dragged him out of the cafeteria. Word spread quickly that he'd been taken to the infirmary, but nobody knew if he was getting real medical attention or just being tossed onto a cot to ride out his misery. In this place, the latter was usually more likely. Still, I hoped in some strange way that they would treat him differently because of who he was. Maybe his fame would buy him a modicum of care. That night, the prison was eerily quiet. Even the usual catcalls and banging on the bars seemed subdued. I guessed the rotting stench and the recent cases of illness had dampened everyone's spirits. My cellmate coughed again, a long, hacking fit that rattled his entire bunk. I tried to sleep through it, but each cough made me more anxious. I was afraid that eventually, I'd be the one curled up on the floor, vomiting my guts out. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and sat on the edge of my bunk. My cellmate muttered incoherently in his sleep, and I realized he was running a fever. He was sweating profusely, beads of perspiration glistening on his forehead even in the dim light. I reached down to feel his shoulder, and he was burning up. He groaned, rolled over, and mumbled something I couldn't make out. I felt useless. We didn't have any real medicine, and the guards weren't exactly rushing to check on us. At breakfast the next day, I noticed there were fewer inmates in the chow hall than usual. A good number must have been too sick to leave their cells. The rest looked drained, a line of pale faces and bloodshot eyes. I took my tray and grimly eyed the food. The oatmeal was watery and lukewarm, and the piece of fruit I was given looked bruised and half-rotten, but at least it didn't smell rancid. With a sigh, I forced it down, chewing slowly so I wouldn't gag. A hushed buzz filled the room, people whispering about the sick, about the rumors of maggots in the kitchen or rats in the vents. One man claimed he'd seen actual mold growing on the walls behind the serving counters. Another insisted the staff was purposely letting the food spoil. a conspiracy to punish us further. I didn't know what to believe, but the tension in the air was undeniable. The more we whispered, the more it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. I glanced around, hoping to see Diddy. No luck. A guard walked by my table, so I mustered the courage to ask if he'd heard anything about him. The guard paused, gave me a hard stare, then snorted. "He's in the infirmary," he said, voice dripping with contempt, probably faking half of it. You know how these big shots are. Then he moved on, leaving me with more questions than answers. After chow, I went back to my cell to check on my cellmate. He was still lying on the bunk, face slick with sweat. He opened his eyes when I walked in and tried to speak, but his voice was so raspy I could hardly understand him. "Water," he said, or something like it. I poured some into a small plastic cup and handed it to him. He drank greedily, then collapsed back onto the pillow. I wondered how many others in this prison were in the same state, neglected and feverish, just waiting for someone to notice. By evening, I heard more rumors. Someone in another block had died overnight, and the guards supposedly carted the body out before sunrise. I didn't know if it was true, but it fueled my growing paranoia. Everywhere I turned, the atmosphere felt charged, like we were all standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into a pit we couldn't climb out of. That rotten smell was still there, seeping through the halls, making me gag whenever I inhaled too deeply. I found myself thinking about Diddy more than I cared to admit. Before arriving here, I never gave him much thought. He was just another celebrity face on TV, but seeing him in the flesh, wasted and hollow, awakened a strange empathy in me. Prison isn't kind to anyone, but it seemed like the system had a special brand of cruelty reserved for him. Maybe the guards enjoyed watching someone with his wealth and fame brought to his knees. Late that night, as I tried once again to fall asleep, a guard banged on my cell door. I jolted upright, heart hammering. "You," he barked, "come with me." My mind raced with possibilities. Had I done something wrong? Was I being relocated? Or was this about my cellmate's condition? I stepped into the corridor, hands at my sides, trying not to look nervous. The guard led me down a dimly lit hallway I'd never been through before. The stink there was even worse, thick enough to taste on my tongue. We stopped outside a door that looked like it hadn't been painted in decades. "In you go," he said, unlocking it. Inside was a cramped office space, a single bare bulb overhead flickering ominously. Another guard stood by a small desk, rummaging through some paperwork. He barely glanced at me. "Need you to help with something," he said flatly. "We're short-staffed. You do this, maybe you get some extra yard time." He tossed a pair of latex gloves onto the desk. My stomach twisted. I had no idea what he wanted from me, but I guessed it had something to do with the sickness spreading around. Sure enough, he led me out of the office and down another corridor, this one quieter, lined with closed doors. The smell intensified until my eyes watered. Finally, we stopped at a door with a small window. The guard opened it, and I felt bile rise in my throat. Inside was a room that looked like a makeshift storage closet. A single bed sat in the middle, with a figure on it who was half covered in a thin blanket. It took me a moment to recognize Diddy. His skin had a sickly pallor, and he lay there, trembling, eyes closed. A small metal sink stood in the corner, and a tray of water cups rested on a rickety table next to it. "He's got a fever," the guard said. "Doc said we gotta keep him hydrated, and apparently you're the lucky volunteer to do just that." I stared at Diddy's face. Beads of sweat clung to his forehead. His lips were chapped, and he seemed to be breathing shallowly. His once robust presence was gone, replaced by someone who looked closer to death than life. "Give him water every 30 minutes, the guard continued. "If he pukes, clean it up. Keep him from choking on it. Understood?" I nodded stiffly, swallowing my revulsion and fear. The guard left, locking the door behind him. Suddenly, I was alone with Diddy, the man I'd only seen from a distance. now laid low by whatever infected food was circulating in this place. I approached the bed cautiously, unsure if he'd recognize me. His eyes fluttered open, just a sliver. He stared at me for a moment, not speaking. I realized he might not even know who I was. I wasn't sure what to say, so I poured some water into a cup and lifted his head a little, pressing the cup to his cracked lips. He drank weakly, barely managing a few sips before he turned his head away. Then he started coughing, a wet, painful sound that made me flinch. I didn't see any buckets or rags, so I looked around, panicking. I found an old trash bin in the corner and held it near him in case he vomited. He coughed for a few seconds, then collapsed back onto the pillow. For what felt like hours, I sat there, watching him drift in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he'd mutter incoherent phrases, something about music or a party, then lapse into stillness. At one point, his eyes snapped open, and he looked right at me. I saw a flash of fear there, or maybe desperation. It was like he wanted to say something, but words failed him. Time lost its meaning in that small room. I did what I could, gave him water, dabbed at his sweat with a rag, and kept an eye on his breathing. My thoughts raced in circles. Where was the doctor? Wasn't there supposed to be medical staff? This was a minimum effort at best, like they were simply waiting to see if he pulled through on his own. In the early hours of the morning, he started to shiver violently. A wave of panic swept over me, and I checked his forehead. It was burning. He was burning. His shirt stuck to his chest, soaked with sweat. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for guards. No one was there. I banged on it a few times, calling out that I needed help. No response. Fear coiled in my gut as I realized if this got worse, there was nothing I could do. He let out a groan, eyes rolling back. I whispered his name, trying to keep him focused, but he was slipping away into some fevered delirium. Finally, the door burst open, and a guard stepped in. He looked annoyed rather than concerned. "What's the problem?" he barked. "He needs a doctor," I shouted, pointing at Diddy, who was convulsing now. The guard glanced at him, rolled his eyes, and muttered something under his breath. Then he left, presumably to call someone. I stayed beside the bed, gripping Diddy's shoulder, trying to steady him. My pulse thundered. I'd never felt so helpless. After an agonizing stretch of time, another staff member appeared. A nurse, if you could call her that. She looked bored, glancing at Diddy as if he were just another checkmark on her list. She took his temperature, frowned, and made a note on a clipboard. Then she shook her head. "It's food poisoning or some kind of infection," she said. "He needs fluids and rest. That's all I can do right now." She left a couple of IV bags and other supplies on the table, instructing me to hold him still while she inserted the needle. I did, though my hands were shaking. Once the line was in, she turned the drip on. Then she walked out, leaving me alone with him again. I stayed there, listening to his labored breathing, the drip of the IV, and the faint hum of the ventilation. I felt trapped in that room, suffocated by the smell of his sweat and the lingering odor of rot that seemed to cling to everything in this prison. I had no idea how much time passed. All I knew was that Diddy was getting worse. Chapter 4: Descent into Illness. By the next morning, the guards had returned me to my own cell, leaving Diddy in that makeshift infirmary room. They didn't bother explaining why they chose me in the first place, nor did they offer any thanks for the hours I spent by his side. My cellmate was still feverish, but at least he was conscious. He told me in a raspy voice that more inmates were getting sick. A wave of illness was sweeping through the blocks, hitting random cells like a twisted lottery. The rumor mill churned faster than ever. Some said the guards were doing it on purpose, tampering with the food. Others claimed the budget was so low that the prison kitchen was forced to serve expired goods. The more imaginative inmates whispered about a systematic plan to reduce overcrowding by letting the sick die. In the end, it didn't matter which theory was right. People were suffering, and nothing was being done to stop it. Chow time had become an exercise in dread. Every morning, noon, and night we lined up for trays of slop, terrified of what might be lurking in each spoonful. I found myself scanning my plate for mold spots or strange odors, sniffing the meat before I put it in my mouth. Even then, I could never be sure. The staff showed no sign of concern. They served the same questionable food day in and day out, their faces unreadable behind the metal counter. I kept an ear open for any news about Diddy. Some inmates who worked cleaning duty near the infirmary hallway claimed they heard him yelling in delirium. Others swore they saw a nurse rush in with more IV bags. None of it was confirmed. The guards refused to answer questions, and it felt like we were living in a sealed chamber of rumors and fear, each story darker than the last. On the third day after my stint in that room, I was summoned again. A guard pounded on my cell door and told me I'd been requested by the infirmary staff. My cellmate, still sick but stable, gave me a concerned look as I left. I didn't know if I'd come back or end up quarantined somewhere. They escorted me through a different hallway this time, one that led directly to a series of small rooms with barred windows. Each room looked like it had once served another purpose, storage, maybe, and had been hastily converted into medical spaces. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, trying and failing to cover the musty odor of neglect. When I entered the room, I saw Diddy again. He was propped up on a cot, an IV line still running into his arm. His eyes were open, but they appeared glazed over, as though he was lost in some fever dream even while awake. A nurse with tired eyes stood by his side, checking his vitals. She waved me over. "He's still dehydrated and his fever isn't breaking," she said quietly, as if reluctant to speak too loudly. "We need someone to keep an eye on him. The infirmary's understaffed, and we've got too many sick inmates right now. You did it before, so you'll do it again." I glanced at Diddy. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by his illness. His skin had taken on a dull, ashen tone, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface. He barely acknowledged my presence, but I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. I gave a small nod, unsure of what comfort I could offer. The nurse handed me a damp cloth and motioned for me to dab his forehead. "Keep him as cool as you can. If he vomits, make sure he doesn't choke. Hit the buzzer by the door if anything goes wrong." She left without another word, leaving me alone with him again. I took the cloth and started wiping his brow. His breath came in shallow rasps, each exhalation a reminder of how fragile he'd become. Minutes turned to hours, and I kept at it, cooling him down, offering small sips of water, checking the IV drip. Occasionally he'd stir, mumble incoherently about parties or people I didn't know. Sometimes he'd clutch at the air, as if reaching for something just out of reach. At one point his eyes snapped open and he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. They don't care," he rasped, voice barely audible. "They want this." I tried to reassure him, but I had no real words to offer. Deep down, I suspected he was right. The institution cared little for inmates, and perhaps even less for someone with a high profile. It was easier for them to let him suffer, maybe even let him die, than to deal with the consequences of properly treating him. He drifted off again, and I kept vigil by his side. The hours seemed endless, the small room lit by a single bulb that buzzed overhead. My stomach growled, but I had no desire to eat, not with the state of the prison's food. A guard slid a tray under the door at one point, a meal of rice, beans, and some unidentifiable protein. The smell wafted up, sour and greasy. I pushed it aside, focusing on Diddy's labored breathing. If there was a God, I silently hoped he was listening, because none of this felt survivable without some kind of intervention. By late afternoon, Diddy's temperature spiked again. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, and his pulse was racing. He let out a guttural moan, and his limbs started shaking. Panic seized me. I shouted for the guard, but no one came. I remembered the nurse telling me to hit the buzzer, so I stumbled over to the door and smacked the red button. It let out a dull ring that echoed through the corridor. Seconds ticked by like hours, and his convulsions got worse. His eyes rolled back in his head and spittle foamed at the corners of his mouth. My heart thudded in my ears. I'd never seen seizures in person, let alone dealt with them. Instinct took over, and I tried to keep him from rolling off the cot. I slipped a folded cloth between his teeth so he wouldn't bite his tongue, hoping I was doing the right thing. He groaned, muscles tensing like steel cables under his skin. Finally, the nurse burst in, a guard on her heels. She muttered a curse under her breath, checking his vitals. She barked orders I couldn't fully process, telling the guard to get more medical supplies. Then she fiddled with his IV, adjusting the flow of fluids and adding something else, a medication maybe. After what felt like an eternity, the seizure subsided, and Diddy collapsed back onto the bed, chest heaving. My own heartbeat felt like it was about to burst through my rib cage. The nurse glared at me like she regretted not having more staff. "Stay with him," she hissed, as if I had any intention of doing otherwise. She hurried out again, presumably to get more supplies or call in another nurse. The guard lingered just a moment, eyeing me with mild curiosity, then followed her out, letting the heavy door slam behind him. I sank onto a small stool by the bed, feeling utterly drained. My shirt was damp with sweat. Diddy's breath rasped in the quiet room, and I tried to steady my own breathing, my lungs still tight with fear. I studied his face, searching for any sign of improvement, but he looked more haunted than ever. Whatever infection had taken hold of him was relentless. In the silence, I heard a faint scratching from somewhere behind the walls. Rats, probably, scuttling through the ductwork. I wondered how many were rotting in the vents, feeding that horrible smell that still refused to leave my senses. And I wondered if that same rot was now inside him, feasting on his insides. At some point, exhaustion overcame me. I dozed off, only to be startled awake by his ragged breathing. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. For a moment, I wasn't sure if he was even conscious. Then he slowly turned his head, focusing on me as though finally registering who I was. "You gotta get out," he croaked, barely audible. "Don't end up like me." My throat tightened. There was no getting out of this place until I served my time, and for him it was even more complicated. He'd be under a microscope no matter where he went, but I couldn't bring myself to say any of that. I just nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder to steady him as he tried to sit up. He managed for a moment before a wave of dizziness sent him back down. Sometime in the evening, the nurse returned to check on him again. She took his temperature, which was marginally lower, but not by much. "He's not out of the woods," she muttered, "but he might pull through if his body fights it." I wanted to ask her what exactly it was. Food poisoning, an infection, something more sinister, but her expression warned me not to push. She finished her check and left, promising to come back later with more medication. I didn't expect her to keep that promise, any more than I expected the guards to show real compassion. Diddy dozed off again, and I stared at the pale walls. I thought about the 1,000 ways prison could break a person, the isolation, the violence, the hopelessness. But there was something uniquely horrifying about being infected from the inside out, forced to consume food that might be poisoned or just plain rotten. Eventually the guard reappeared and told me my time was up. Another inmate would take over, or maybe a staff member, he didn't say. I hesitated, looking at Diddy's limp form, wondering if I should stay. But the guard's glare made it clear I had no choice. With a heavy heart, I rose and followed him out into the hallway. I didn't even get a chance to say anything to Diddy. Walking back to my cell felt like stepping out of a nightmare and into a gloomier reality. My cellmate was dozing fitfully, still coughing. The entire block seemed quieter than usual, like everyone was bracing for something worse to come. As I settled onto my bunk, I realized my hands were trembling. I couldn't shake the image of Diddy convulsing, the nurse rushing in at the last second. All I could think was that if a man as powerful as Diddy was left to rot here, what hope did the rest of us have? Chapter 5. The Rot Inside. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Diddy's convulsions, the foam on his lips, the panic in the nurse's eyes. My cellmate's coughing fits only added to the tension. Each ragged hack a reminder that sickness was spreading like a plague through these walls. By morning, my nerves were frayed, and I felt a scratch in my own throat. I told myself it was just paranoia, but a small seed of fear had already taken root. The guards ordered us to the yard for recreation. Normally, I would jump at the chance to get some fresh air, but even the yard felt claustrophobic these days. The perimeter fences loomed, topped with razor wire, and the guards watched us with their hands on their batons. There wasn't much to do except pace in circles and try not to think about the stench that seemed to follow us everywhere. Some inmates worked out, pumping iron in a makeshift gym area, but the rest just lurked in corners, trading rumors about who'd fallen ill overnight. I spotted a group of guys whispering to each other, casting glances toward the guard tower. Curiosity got the better of me, and I drifted closer to hear what they were saying. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head, claimed he'd seen Diddy wheeled out on a gurney, heading for some off-site hospital. Another swore that was just a lie, that Diddy was still in the infirmary, too weak to stand. None of them seemed to know the truth, but all of them assumed the worst. Eventually, I retreated to a corner of the yard, trying to keep my distance from the chatter. My throat burned. I coughed a few times, hoping it would pass. The air tasted stale, even outside. It was like the rot had seeped into everything, even the sunlight felt tainted. I leaned against the chain-link fence, ignoring the suspicious glare of a guard stationed nearby. When yard time ended, we filed back inside. Immediately, the smell hit me stronger than before. Sweat and old grime clung to the hallway walls, but underneath it all was that sweet, sickly scent of decay. I wondered if I'd ever not smell it again. It was in my hair, my clothes, my nostrils. I could taste it on my tongue, as if it had replaced the oxygen I breathed. Back in the cell, my cellmate lay on his bunk, groaning softly. His fever had spiked overnight, and he looked worse than ever. His cheeks were sunken, and his lips were dry and cracked. He asked for water, so I filled the plastic cup from the sink and handed it to him. He downed it in one gulp, then clutched his stomach like it hurt to drink. "We gotta get you to the infirmary," I said, though I knew the chances of the guards caring were slim. He gave me a weak shrug, as if to say he'd already resigned himself to fate. Chow time came and went, but I couldn't bring myself to eat much. The lunch looked like some kind of stew, the ingredients too mushy to identify. My appetite fled at the first whiff. I nibbled on a piece of bread, ignoring the greenish spot near the crust. Another inmate nearby coughed, hacking so violently that some of the stew splattered on the table. The guards gave him a warning glare, but did nothing to help. I scanned the cafeteria, hoping to see Diddy, but he was nowhere in sight. The entire room felt subdued, as if everyone was just waiting for a spark to set off a riot, or for the infection to claim another victim. The only sounds were the clinking of utensils on plastic trays and the occasional muttered curse. That evening, as I sat alone in my cell, a guard strolled by and slipped a note through the bars. I frowned, picking it up. In scrawled handwriting it read, "He's back in the block. Don't let the guards see you asking around. No signature, no name." I looked into the corridor to see who might have passed it, but it was empty. My pulse quickened. If Diddy was back, it meant he was still alive, but how long would that last in these conditions? I waited for the right moment. When the guards finished their rounds, I quietly left my cell, feigning a trip to the bathroom. I slipped into a side hallway, heading toward the direction I guessed they'd keep Diddy if he'd been moved out of the infirmary. The stink was stronger there, a combination of bleach, vomit, and that underlying rot. At the end of the corridor, I saw a guard standing watch outside a single cell. He looked bored. checking his watch. I couldn't just walk up. That would draw too much attention. Instead, I lingered at the corner, trying to look casual. From where I stood, I could make out a glimpse of the cell interior. The door was open just enough for me to see a bunk and a figure lying on it. My heart thumped when I recognized Diddy's silhouette. He was curled on his side, facing the wall, his body unmoving except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The guard turned his head, so I quickly retreated, not wanting to be spotted. My mind whirled with questions. Why bring him back here if he was still so sick? Did they think he was stable enough, or did they just not care? I returned to my cell, forcing my face into a neutral expression as I passed other inmates. Nobody stopped me, and I slipped back behind bars without incident. That night, my cellmate's fever broke suddenly. I found him drenched in sweat, sheets soaked through but breathing more easily. Relief washed over me, though it was tempered by the knowledge that recovery in this place was uncertain. He looked up at me with tired eyes, trying to form words, but all he managed was a nod of thanks. I offered him another cup of water, which he sipped slowly this time. His gaze flicked toward my bunk, as if he wanted to ask where I'd been, but I just shook my head. I couldn't sleep again. My thoughts were stuck on Diddy, alone in that cell, probably fighting the same infection that had nearly killed him. The guards wouldn't hesitate to ignore his cries if he relapsed. In fact, I suspected some of them enjoyed his misery. The power dynamic was twisted. The more famous he was, the less sympathy they offered. Maybe they hated him for his wealth, or maybe they just hated all inmates equally. Around midnight, screams echoed through the hallway. I shot up in bed, heart pounding. The screams were guttural, desperate. Then I heard a guard's voice, the words too muffled to understand, followed by more screaming, another sick inmate maybe. I glanced at my cellmate, who was sitting upright now, eyes wide with fear. We both knew better than to call out or draw attention, so we waited, hearts racing, until the screams died down. In the morning, the guard who delivered breakfast trays told us someone had thrown up blood in the hallway during the night. He found it amusing, describing the puddle in graphic detail before sliding our trays under the cell door. My cellmate looked at his own tray like it was radioactive. I wasn't much better. I forced myself to sip the watery oatmeal, ignoring the lumps and the off smell. My stomach rebelled, but I refused to go hungry. After breakfast, I dared to venture down the hallway again. I needed to see if Diddy was still there, still alive. The guard who'd been posted at his cell was gone, replaced by a different one, a taller man with a stern face. I waited for him to glance away, then peeked around the corner. The cell door was closed now, but through the small window I could see Diddy lying on the bunk, eyes open. For a moment I thought he was staring right at me, but his gaze seemed unfocused, like he was trapped in his own thoughts. I whispered his name, barely audible, and his eyes flickered, almost like he heard me. But then the guard shifted, and I ducked away. I hurried back to my cell, anxious that I'd be caught. My cellmate was awake, leaning against the wall. He gave me a questioning look. "Just checking on something," I said, knowing I shouldn't say more. He nodded, too drained to pry. It struck me how we were all isolated in our own worries, with no real way to help each other beyond sharing a few whispered words or scraps of information. That day, I tried to keep my mind busy with push-ups, pacing, anything to burn off the nervous energy. But no matter what I did, the smell of rot followed, reminding me of how fragile life here was. I thought about the outside world, about people eating fresh meals at restaurants, sleeping in warm beds without fear of infection or neglect. It felt like a different planet. In the late afternoon, a guard stopped by our cell and told my cellmate he had an appointment at the infirmary. I assumed it was to check on his recovery, maybe to make sure he wouldn't spread whatever he had. My cellmate shot me a look that conveyed both relief and dread. I wished him luck as he stepped out, and then the doors slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone. For hours I sat in that tiny space, hearing distant coughs and occasional groans. I counted the cracks in the ceiling, trying not to imagine what might happen if Diddy took a turn for the worse. Evening chow time arrived and the guards ushered us to the cafeteria. I stood in line, took the tray, but my stomach clenched at the sight of the food. A slice of questionable meatloaf and a spoonful of something that might have been mashed potatoes. The stench was enough to make me dry heave, so I set the tray aside and opted for water. I scanned the room, but Diddy wasn't there. Part of me had hoped he'd show up, even if he could barely walk. At least then I'd know he was alive and mobile. But the seat where he usually sat was empty, as if mocking me. Several inmates around me were whispering about another wave of sickness, some sort of outbreak. One said he'd seen a guard wearing a mask, but I couldn't verify that. Chapter 6: Institutional Neglect. I was jolted awake by a guard's baton rapping against the bars. My eyes flew open to see him scowling at me, his lips pulled into a tight line. "On your feet, we need you again," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. My heart kicked up a notch. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and followed him out of the cell, half expecting another night of watching Diddy fight for his life. We took a winding path through corridors I'd never seen before, turning corner after corner until I lost track of my bearings. The smell of bleach was stronger here, mixed with that ever-present rot. My shoes squeaked on the tiled floor, still wet from what looked like a recent mopping. We stopped at a metal door, and the guard unlocked it, motioning for me to enter. Inside was a small waiting area, furnished with worn plastic chairs and a desk where a bored-looking nurse sat flipping through files. She glanced up, gave me a disinterested once-over, and pointed to a door on the right. "He's in there. Don't make a mess," she said curtly. The guard shoved me forward and I stepped into a tiny room that smelled of disinfectant and stale air. Diddy sat on a metal stool, his back against the wall, arms limp at his sides. He looked like a scarecrow someone had forgotten to pack away. His head jerked up when I entered, and for a split second I saw recognition in his eyes. Then he coughed, the sound sharp and wet, and turned his face away as though ashamed. There was a sink in the corner with a few paper cups. An IV stand with a half-empty bag of fluid stood nearby, the tubing snaking down to his arm. A worn blanket lay crumpled on the floor. He said nothing, just stared at the far wall. I took a tentative step closer. He looked marginally better than the last time I'd seen him. Less pale maybe, but he was still a shell of the man he must have been on the outside. I cleared my throat. "You all right?" The question felt stupid the moment it left my mouth. Clearly, he wasn't all right, but I didn't know what else to say. He shifted his gaze to me, eyes dull but faintly focused. "I'm alive," he rasped. "That's something." He tried to stand, but his legs wobbled, so he sat back down. I grabbed a paper cup, filled it with water from the sink, and handed it to him. He drank slowly, each swallow seeming to take effort. I noticed his hands were unsteady, trembling as he gripped the cup. A guard stuck his head in the room. "You got 1 hour," he barked, then disappeared. The door clicked shut, and we were alone. For a while, I paced the small space, unsure of what I was supposed to do. Diddy kept his eyes on the floor, breathing in shallow bursts. I wanted to ask him how he got here, what it felt like to be singled out in prison, but it all seemed too invasive. Eventually, he broke the silence first. "They want me to beg for help," he said quietly, "but I won't give them that." His voice held a hollow defiance, a spark of the pride that might have once defined him. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it was wise to hold on to pride in a place like this. "You just need to get better," I said, crouching down beside him. "Focus on that." He let out a humorless laugh that dissolved into another cough. "Hard to get better when the food is poison, when they don't check on you for hours, let you soak in your own sweat." I hesitated, then asked, "Were you really poisoned, or is it just rotten food?" The question felt blunt, but I had to know. His gaze flicked to the IV stand. "Doctors if you can call them that, said it was some kind of bacterial infection from undercooked meat. Could have been intentional, could have been neglect. At this point, does it matter? The question hung in the stale air. I thought about the rumors swirling in the blocks, about maggots in the rice, mold in the bread, dead rats in the vents. We lived in an institution that seemed to treat us like disposable objects, so the distinction between malice and negligence was thin. He reached for the IV bag, tapping it with a finger. This is probably the best care I've had in weeks. They only gave it to me because I nearly died, he said, voice hushed. A part of me wanted to believe the system wasn't that cruel, that there was some oversight that would protect us from actual poisoning. But every guard's cold stare, every unidentifiable lump of food on my tray told me otherwise. I glanced at Diddy, studying the lines etched into his face. He looked like he'd aged a decade in just a few weeks. We fell into silence again, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights. Outside, I heard footsteps echoing in the hallway, the murmur of voices. I wondered how many other inmates were locked up nearby, suffering through fevers, convulsions, or worse, while the staff looked on with disinterest. My mind drifted to my cellmate, who'd been taken to the infirmary. I still hadn't seen him since. A friend of mine got sick too, I said quietly, as if confiding a secret. He had a fever for days. They finally took him away, but I don't know if he's gotten any real treatment. Diddy closed his eyes, inhaling slowly. I'm sorry, he murmured. It's not just me, is it? This place, it's falling apart. I think it's been broken for a long time, I said. We're just seeing the cracks more clearly now. He opened his eyes and gave a slow nod. For a moment we shared a fragile understanding of our shared predicament. I'd never have imagined I'd be speaking to him on equal terms, but sickness and confinement have a way of leveling status. The door burst open, and the nurse from earlier strode in, followed by the guard. She had a clipboard in hand, eyes flicking between me and Diddy. Time's up, she said, a note of impatience in her voice. We need to move him back. Back where? I asked, alarmed. He can barely walk. She shrugged. He's stable enough. We got other patients who need this space. Diddy tried to stand, but his legs gave out. I caught him under one arm, helping him stay upright. The guard stepped forward, took hold of his other arm, and pulled him toward the door. The nurse led the way, and I followed, heart pounding. We moved through corridors until we reached another cell block, one I recognized from the time I'd seen him a few days ago. The guard unlocked a cell, and they unceremoniously deposited him inside, handing me the blanket and the half-full IV bag. Hang that on the wall if you want, the guard said with a smirk. We're not a 5-star hospital. I bit back a retort, not wanting to provoke him. Instead, I eased Diddy onto the bunk, hooking the IV bag onto a protruding piece of metal on the wall. He lay there, breathing heavily, sweat glistening on his forehead. The cell was cramped and dingy, with a single barred window that let in only the faintest shaft of light. The nurse scribbled something on her clipboard, then tapped the guard on the shoulder. I've got other rounds, she muttered, already heading off. The guard took his cue to leave as well, locking us in. I hadn't expected that. Being locked in with him. My stomach flipped. How long were they going to keep me in here? I stood by the bunk, uncertain. Diddy opened his eyes and managed a weak smile. Guess you're my roommate now, he said, voice scratchy. I shrugged, sinking onto the edge of the bunk. At least this meant he wouldn't be alone, and maybe I could keep an eye on him. The hours dragged on, and I realized how exhausted I was. I hadn't slept well in days, but every time I tried to rest, a wave of anxiety jolted me awake. Diddy drifted in and out of a fitful doze, his breathing raspy. I gave him water whenever he stirred, watching his lips tremble with each sip. The smell in this block was just as bad as anywhere else, perhaps worse, as if the rot had concentrated in the corners of these cells. At some point, the guard delivered 2 trays of food, if you could call it that. They were identical, a lump of mashed something, a slice of processed meat, and a small piece of bread. Diddy eyed his tray with open disgust. "I can't," he whispered, turning away. I couldn't blame him, but hunger gnawed at me. I picked at my own tray, trying to ignore the faint sour smell emanating from the meat. After a few cautious bites, I gave up, my stomach churning at the thought of swallowing more. Night fell, or so I assumed, since the meager light through the window disappeared. The overhead bulb buzzed, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Diddy shivered under the blanket, so I tried to tuck it around him more securely. He mumbled something about the days blending together, how he couldn't remember how long he'd been here. I wanted to tell him it wouldn't be forever, but I couldn't lie. His condition looked too grave, and the staff's neglect felt deliberate. Eventually, we both dozed off. I slept in a cramped position at the foot of the bunk, stirred awake now and then by Diddy's coughing. Each time I roused, the stench in the cell reminded me where I was. There was no escaping it. The reality was relentless. Sometime before dawn, I heard boots in the hallway and jerked awake. A guard banged on the cell door. "Rise and shine," he called mockingly. "You 2 lovebirds had enough alone time?" With a clang, he unlocked the door and motioned for me to step out. I hesitated, looking at Diddy, who was half asleep, eyes barely open. The guard grabbed my arm. "Come on. He's not your problem anymore." I let out a shaky breath and gave Diddy a last glance. He lifted his hand in a weak wave, as if to say goodbye, or maybe thanks. Then I was pulled out into the corridor, the door slamming shut behind me. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point. When I woke, my cellmate told me that the block was buzzing with rumors. Word had spread that a high-profile inmate had collapsed and nearly died, and the staff had barely intervened in time. Some said it happened just down the hall, others said it was in the cafeteria. No one seemed to know for sure, but the name on everyone's lips was Diddy. Whispers of his deteriorating condition rattled through the corridors, fueling a sense of collective anxiety. I tried to piece together what might have happened after I left him in that cell. Had he suffered another seizure, or had his fever shot up again? My gut churned with worry. At Chow, I overheard a couple of inmates talking in hushed tones, one of them swearing he saw a team of guards carrying Diddy out of the block on a stretcher. The other shook his head, insisting that was just a story to stir up drama. I had no way of knowing the truth, and the staff certainly wasn't going to clarify. The food was as dismal as ever. Lumpy oatmeal, a single slice of bread, and a dab of jam that tasted more like chemicals than fruit. The stench clung to every corner of the cafeteria, and I noticed several inmates either skipping their meals entirely or eating so slowly they might as well have. Hunger and fear formed a toxic brew in the air. Every now and then someone coughed, and all eyes turned in their direction, half expecting them to keel over. After Chow, I returned to my cell, the hours dragging on without any new information. My mind kept drifting back to Diddy, replaying the moments I'd sat by his side, watching him convulse or shiver with fever. The guards, the nurses, none of them seemed to care if he lived or died, as long as the paperwork was kept neat. It dawned on me that I'd never seen a real doctor here, just a couple of exhausted nurses who seemed out of their depth. By late afternoon, my cellmate and I were forced to head out for recreation, though it felt more like forced yard time. The sky overhead was gray, threatening rain, and a damp wind cut through the chain-link fences. I paced aimlessly, trying to decide if I should risk asking a guard about Diddy's condition. The memory of their scornful faces stopped me. They would likely laugh or threaten me with solitary. As if on cue, thunder rumbled in the distance, and a light drizzle began to fall. A guard shouted at us to line up, probably to move us back inside before the storm got worse. We obeyed, too beaten down to argue. Halfway through the line, I saw the tall guard who had dragged me away from Diddy's cell. He spotted me, gave a mocking salute, then motioned for me to step aside. My stomach dropped. I had no idea what he wanted, but it couldn't be good. Without explanation, he marched me toward an isolated corner of the yard, away from the others. Another guard trailed behind, just in case I tried something stupid. The tall guard leaned in, his breath hot and reeking of stale coffee. "You've seen enough of that so-called celebrity, haven't you?" he sneered. "Just so you know, if you keep sniffing around him, you'll wind up in the hole. Or worse." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my face neutral. "I'm not sniffing around, I was just following orders to help in the infirmary." He laughed, a harsh sound. "Orders? We can make up any orders we like. Don't forget that." He jabbed a finger at my chest. "You're nothing here, a nobody. Stay in your lane, got it?" I nodded, forcing myself to stay calm. He stared me down for a few seconds more, then signaled for the other guard to take me back to the line. My heart hammered in my chest. The message was loud and clear. Don't get involved, don't show concern, let Diddy rot. When we got back inside, the smell seemed even stronger than before, as if the damp weather had stirred up whatever was festering in the walls. The guard shoved me toward my cell and I slumped onto my bunk, hands shaking with anger. My cellmate watched quietly from below, sensing my mood. He didn't ask questions, and I was too agitated to talk. Hours crawled by in tense silence, until finally the clang of metal doors announced the arrival of the dinner carts. The portion was smaller this time, some bland-looking noodles and a spoonful of sauce. I considered skipping it, but my stomach growled. I forced down a few bites, hoping I wasn't swallowing something that would make me keel over. The water tasted metallic, as always, but I used it to wash down the meal. Suddenly, the entire block erupted in noise. Shouts echoed off the walls, and I heard the sound of something heavy crashing. My cellmate and I jumped to our feet, pressing our faces to the bars. Down the corridor, 2 inmates were wrestling with a guard who had tried to break them apart. Another guard rushed in, baton raised, striking one of the inmates in the back. The inmate let out a howl of pain and fell to his knees. Chaos swirled as more inmates started yelling, pounding on their cell doors. Guards shouted for backup. In the confusion, I caught words like, "He's dead," and "They let him die." My blood ran cold. Could they be talking about Diddy? Or was it another inmate who had succumbed to the sickness? My heart pounded and I strained to see down the corridor, but the mass of bodies blocked my view. Guards swarmed in, pepper spray canisters at the ready. The metallic tang of the spray wafted through the air, making my eyes water. One guard smacked his baton against the bars of our cell, telling us to step back. Eventually, the uproar subsided, and I heard the scuffling of boots dragging someone away. My cellmate and I stood in stunned silence. The corridor was eerily quiet after that. A sense of dread settled in my gut like a stone. Someone had died, or was close to it. The tension that followed felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap. Time dragged on, and none of us got any clear answers. The guards locked down the block, confining us to our cells. We heard them moving around, barking orders, but they wouldn't speak to any of us directly. Lights out came earlier than usual. I lay on my bunk, hands behind my head, staring at the ceiling. My mind spun with questions. Was Diddy dead? Did the outbreak claim another victim? Were we next? Sometime in the night, I drifted off into a restless sleep, only to be awakened by a guard banging his baton on the bars again. "On your feet," he hissed. My heart leapt to my throat. Had something happened? My cellmate stirred, but the guard only pointed at me. "Just you." I followed him out into the corridor, which was dimly lit. He led me to a small room near the infirmary hallway. I half expected to see Diddy lying there again, but instead, the nurse stood waiting with a grim expression. She ordered me to sit on a metal chair while she flipped through some documents on a clipboard. "There's been a development," she said, her voice low. "We need inmates to help with cleaning." She glanced at me, her eyes dull. "The warden wants certain areas scrubbed down. Something about controlling the spread of disease." I swallowed, a sour taste in my mouth. Disease? So it's official then? People are actually dying from the food? She avoided my gaze, focusing on her clipboard instead. I'm not authorized to discuss that. All I know is we have an unusual number of cases with severe gastrointestinal symptoms, fevers, and in some instances sepsis. You do the math. She handed me a mop and a bucket along with a pair of rubber gloves. You'll be scrubbing the cafeteria floor under guard supervision. Refuse, and you'll go to the hole. My hands shook as I pulled on the gloves. Cleaning up was the last thing I wanted to do, especially if it meant dealing with vomit or worse. But I had no choice. A guard led me to the cafeteria, which was empty and dimly lit by a few overhead fluorescents. The smell of disinfectant was overpowering, trying to mask the underlying stench. My stomach twisted, and I struggled not to gag. As I dunked the mop into the bucket, my mind kept wondering, where was Diddy in all this? Was he lying in some corner of the prison, rotting away? Had he become another statistic, another nameless victim of neglect? The swirl of thoughts made me clumsy, and I nearly knocked the bucket over. The guard supervising me barked at me to focus. I mopped in silence, each stroke a bitter reminder of my powerlessness. The floor was stained in places, spots that looked like old vomit or spilled meals. I tried not to think about whose mess I was cleaning up or what had caused it. The guard hovered over me, baton in hand, making sure I didn't slack off. Hours seemed to pass before I was finally done. My arms ached, and sweat dripped down my face despite the cool air. The guard ushered me out and walked me back toward my cell. On the way, I saw a couple of inmates in the hallway, pale and coughing, stumbling as they tried to follow a nurse. The scene filled me with a dark realization. This wasn't just about Diddy anymore. This place was unraveling, and we were all caught in its downward spiral. When I got back, my cellmate was awake, eyes wide with worry. I told him about the cleaning, about the nurse's mention of sepsis. He shook his head, pressing his lips together. We both knew the score. The prison wasn't equipped to handle an outbreak. We were living in a tinderbox, and a single spark could consume us all. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. In the following days, the situation escalated. More inmates fell ill, and the halls filled with the echo of coughing, retching, and desperate pleas for help. The guards wore masks now, simple cloth masks that did little to hide their contempt. Every so often, a nurse would hustle by with an IV bag or a tray of medication, but the help felt random, disorganized. I heard rumors that the warden was in a panic, trying to keep the media from learning about the mounting number of sick prisoners. News of a potential scandal began to trickle through the blocks. Whispers of phone calls to lawyers, families threatening to contact the press, staff scurrying to cover their tracks. Everyone knew something was terribly wrong, but no one seemed willing or able to fix it. The tension was at a fever pitch, and it didn't take much for fights to break out in the cafeteria, in the yard, even in the showers. All the while, my mind circled back to Diddy. I asked around, but nobody knew anything concrete. Some said he'd been transferred to an external hospital. Others said he was in solitary. The guards gave me nothing but cold stares or threats whenever I inquired. My cellmates suggested I keep my head down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know what happened to him. One afternoon, as I was returning from a mandatory medical screening, little more than a nurse taking my temperature, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart skip a beat. A group of guards was wheeling a stretcher down the hall, heading toward the exit. A limp figure lay on it, covered by a thin sheet. For a moment I froze, fear gripping me that it could be Diddy, or maybe it was someone else I knew, another victim of the rot. I couldn't see the face, and the guards barked at me to move along. The image haunted me for hours afterward. That evening, the lockdown siren blared. We were ordered to remain in our cells, no exceptions. The lights dimmed and we waited in tense silence, listening to footsteps pounding in the corridors. Muffled shouts reached us, though the words were unclear. My cellmate and I exchanged worried looks, bracing for the worst. Suddenly, the power flickered, plunging the block into near darkness before the backup lights kicked in, casting everything in a sickly orange glow. Minutes felt like hours, but finally a guard passed by, his face grim. He didn't stop to explain, just kept going. The sense of doom settled in deeper. We heard more movement, more shouting, then a heavy thud that shook the floor. My cellmate and I pressed our ears to the bars, trying to catch any scrap of information. Nothing came. Eventually dawn broke, revealing a block that looked almost deserted. Some cells were empty, those inmates presumably taken to the infirmary or off-site. Others were locked up, their occupants too sick to move. My cellmate and I stepped out when the guards allowed it, heading to the chow hall with cautious steps. The line was shorter than I'd ever seen it. The place was quiet, and the stench of disinfectant battled with the ever-present sour odor of decay. I managed a few bites of breakfast, ignoring the queasiness gnawing at my gut. My cellmate ate nothing, just stared at his tray. A hush blanketed the room, as though everyone was waiting for some announcement, some resolution. But none came. We were herded back to our cells, left to stew in uncertainty. Late that afternoon, a guard stopped at our cell. "You?" he said, pointing at me. "Pack your stuff. You're being moved." My heart hammered. Was I being transferred, released, thrown into solitary? I gathered my meager belongings, a toothbrush, a couple of books, some letters, and stepped out. The guard led me through a series of twisting hallways until we reached a small administrative office I'd never seen before. A man in a cheap suit waited there, looking impatient. Another guard stood behind him, arms folded. "Sign this," the suited man said, shoving a form at me. "It's a confidentiality agreement. You're being relocated to another facility due to a medical situation." I blinked, scanning the form. Legal jargon, disclaimers, warnings about discussing the conditions in MDC Brooklyn with anyone. My stomach churned. This was a cover-up, plain and simple. I looked at the guard, who gave me a warning glare. I realized I had no choice. I signed, my hand shaking slightly as I scrawled my name on the line. Before I could ask a question, the man in the suit snatched the paper away. "You'll be transported immediately. Don't speak to anyone on the outside about what happened here. You do, you'll face additional charges." He motioned to the guard, who grabbed me by the arm and shoved me out the door. In a daze, I was led through another corridor to a rear entrance of the prison. A transport van waited, engine idling. 2 more guards stood by, guns at their hips. The door slid open, and they shoved me inside. The door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness except for a small barred window near the top of the van. The engine revved, and we lurched forward, leaving MDC Brooklyn behind. My mind spun, trying to process what was happening. Part of me couldn't believe I was actually leaving. After what felt like hours, the van stopped, and the doors opened. We were at another detention facility, smaller but no less oppressive. I was processed quickly, the staff moving with mechanical efficiency. Soon I found myself in a new cell, alone this time. The smell here was different, still unpleasant, but not that same cloying rot. It felt bizarre to be relieved by that. Days passed, and I settled into the new routine. The food wasn't great, but it wasn't rancid. I didn't see any signs of widespread illness, and the guards, while still tough, weren't as overtly hostile as the ones in Brooklyn. It took me a while to realize how much tension I'd been carrying, how I'd grown used to the daily fear of collapsing from tainted meals. But I never got any news about Diddy. No one in this new place had heard anything about him. It was as though he vanished, a secret the system had locked away. Sometimes in the dim light of my new cell, I replayed the memories. Him shivering on a cot, his hollow cheeks, the desperate look in his eyes. I wondered if he'd made it out alive, if he'd recovered enough to eventually return to court and face his charges, or if that infected meal had claimed him in the end. Weeks later, I was summoned by a staff member for a scheduled call with my attorney. He asked me about conditions back at MDC Brooklyn, about the rumors of an outbreak. My heart pounded at the question, remembering the confidentiality agreement. The threat of additional charges hung over me like a storm cloud. I deflected, saying I was moved for health reasons, that I didn't know specifics. The attorney sounded skeptical, but didn't press too hard. When I returned to my cell, I sat on my bunk, staring at the drab walls. A wave of guilt washed over me. I was safe now, relatively speaking, but Diddy's fate remained a haunting question mark. The system had buried the truth, along with who knows how many sick inmates. And I was complicit in my silence. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I could almost smell that pungent odor again. The rot that clung to everything in MDC Brooklyn. I tasted the rancid meat on my tongue, felt the clammy sweat on Diddy's forehead as I tried to cool him down. Even with distance and time, those memories were as vivid as ever. I still don't know what ultimately happened to him. Maybe he recovered. Maybe he was quietly released to a hospital. Or maybe he slipped away in the night, another casualty of institutional neglect. But I do know that place, those walls, that rotten air, was designed to break men, whether through physical sickness or psychological torment. And for all his fame and fortune, Diddy was just another inmate there, no more immune than the rest of us. Sometimes late at night, I replay my final memory of him, lying on that bunk, the IV bag swaying gently, eyes half open and filled with pain. I hear his voice in my head, a ragged whisper in the silence. They want this. Whether it was poison or negligence, it all amounted to the same thing. MDC Brooklyn was a place where human life held no value. The system had rotted from the inside out, and in the end, we were all just prisoners of that decay.